Hey, what's up, Logos American History students? Welcome to June 10th, 2020, day 53 of our e-learning experience, day 3 of term 6. We're about halfway through the first week of term 6, and it's feeling like a good term already. Off to a great start. Talking about, one of my favorite presidents to talk about. Not one of my favorite presidents, but of course talking about President Nixon, right? And yesterday I spent some time talking about how Nixon dealt with the domestic policies of the country, how he led the American people. And the question of the day was about, what makes a good leader personality-wise. And some really good responses to that question of the day. Not as many as I'd like to see, right? I think we have across these two classes darn near 20 students, so I'd like to see more responses to that question of the day. It's really easy. It's an easy way to earn points, and again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just your opinion. But it got me thinking. Some of these responses we're talking about. A good president, a good personality trait of a president, is that they can, lead the American people, in a responsive way and in a way that gets us through the hard times and accentuates the good times. That's what makes a good president, right? Someone who unites the people and gets us through hard times and leads us through successful times. And I just don't think Nixon did that. Nixon was not about uniting the country. He was about dividing the country. Now, one thing I will say Nixon was really good at, handshakes. And if you don't believe me, let me show you. Let's go ahead and take a look at our well, before we take a look at our blackboard, let me just share with you some famous handshakes of Richard Nixon, right? First, who we got? So he got good practice as the vice president shaking hands, right? Here he is shaking hands when he was vice president with President Eisenhower, right? He eventually, or as vice president, he was the person who visited Cuba and shook hands with Fidel Castro after he took over Cuba. Fidel Castro was the communist leader who would almost get us to the verge of nuclear war not long after this, when JFK became president. But that was when Nixon was vice president, not long after Castro takes over Cuba. Went down there to shake his hand. What else we got? Oh yes, mentioned John F. Kennedy. Well, Nixon tried to be president after he was vice president. He ran against this guy here, gave him a nice handshake, and then lost the election, right? Don't worry, Nixon's going to come back, right? Last term, when we were talking about the assassination of JFK and the conspiracy theories, someone thought that this guy might have arranged it, right? Put out a hit on this guy? Maybe. Who else do we got Nixon shaking hands with? Oh, Elvis, yeah. Elvis visited the White House and got a good photo op with President Nixon. How about that? Elvis Presley, king of rock and roll. Who's this guy? Kind of hard to see. Let's see if we can zoom in. That's an older Nixon after he was president. And that is a very young Donald Trump. Yep. Nixon and Trump shaking hands. How about that? And there's two more handshakes that I want to share with you. But before we get to that, we got to put some context in this, because these are actually important handshakes. That right there is a leader of a country that's going to be part of the question of the day. Before we get to that, though, let's go back to our blackboard and look at what our question of the day is and what our agenda for the day is, right? The assignment for today, if we go into assignments, yesterday we did Chapter 25, Section 1, which was about Nixon's domestic policy, right? Domestic issues, how he handled the issues here in America. And the main issues here in America during Nixon's presidency during the 1970s were the economy, right? He tried. It's hard for the president to fix the economy, right? Usually they do more harm than good when they try. But then also race issues, right? And, if you read the section, if you did the assignment, you saw, and if you watched the video, Nixon tried to stir up racism in this country because it helped him politically, right? It was called the Southern Strategy. He wanted all the Southern racists who had left the Democratic Party over their support of civil rights, he wanted them to come join him and the Republican Party. And it worked, right? And then other domestic issues like crime and protests and things like that. And, you know, he pretty much shut down the protests. He shut down the Vietnam War protests by ending the Vietnam War. So I got to give him credit for that. But I also have to not give him credit for that because before he was president, when he was running for president, he secretly met with the Vietnamese as a private citizen while they were negotiating a peace treaty with President Johnson. And he told them, don't sign this peace treaty with President Johnson. Wait for after the election, and I, when I'm president, will give you a better deal. That right there is treason, my friends. But that's a different story. It is a foreign policy issue. Now, Nixon wasn't president yet, so he shouldn't have been conducting foreign policy. That's illegal. That's treason. But Chapter 25, Section 2, if we go into the assignment, is about, if we download the reading section, which is right there under downloads, go ahead and download the reading. And this is all about Nixon's foreign policy. And you know what? Got to give credit, like I said, credit where credit's due. His foreign policy, I think, was much more successful than his domestic policy. Why do I say that? Ended the Vietnam War, that's one. But then also, he and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who's one of the most famous Secretary of States in American history, one of the best Secretary of States in American history, really, they were able to really establish a good relationship, or a better relationship, with two of America's worst enemies, worst adversaries, Russia, the Soviet Union, and China, right? Nixon was the first American president to ever visit China, ever, right? There he is, walking on the Great Wall. How about that, right? And that led to, after decades of the U.S. having no relationship with China whatsoever, it led to, a warmer and closer relationship, to the point where we are with China now, where, I mean, we depend on each other, right? And then also the Soviet Union. This was the height of the Cold War. I mentioned we almost went to nuclear war just a few years before Nixon became president. We almost went to nuclear war with Russia, or the Soviets, over Cuba. Nixon was the first president, and there would be other presidents to follow his lead, to negotiate a nuclear arms reduction treaty with the Soviets, right? He actually was able to sit down with the leader of the Soviet Union and reach an agreement where both the United States and the Soviet Union would begin limiting their supply of nukes. They both agreed, we don't like each other, we still have a bunch of nukes to use against each other, but you know what? We don't need this many nukes. Let's reduce the number of nukes. Good job, Nixon, good job. So again, I gotta give him credit on that. But, again, there's always a but. I will say this, right? We saw him shaking hands with Castro. Castro's a bad dude, right? Saw him shaking hands with some other guys who I think are bad dudes. That's Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet dictator. Bad dude. Nixon had no problem shaking hands with him, and probably one of the worst people in history. That's Nixon, who looks very excited to be shaking Mao Zedong's hand. Mao Zedong has the distinction of being responsible for more deaths than any person in history, right? Tens of millions of his own people were killed under Mao's rule of China. Hey, man, shake his hand, right? Way more deaths he's responsible for than Hitler, than Mussolini, than Stalin. Mao takes the cake, and there's old President Nixon shaking hands with him. Hey, at least it got us a relationship with China, which has benefited the United States quite a bit. And that's what the question of the day is all about. If we go back to, where are we at? Question of the day, which, remember, you have these 6 questions that go along with the reading. You can submit those through the online submission or through the Google Forms submission. But then we also have our question of the day. And again, this is just an open-ended question. What do you think? What do you know? What do you know? What do you think about America's relationship with China? And what do you know about America's relationship with Russia, right? It's been a complicated relationship for decades, going back to the 70s, and even to this day. It's a very complicated relationship. And again, when you think about Nixon's relationship with China and the Soviet Union, what about the current president's stance on China and Russia? Very different stances, but very interesting stances, and different from other presidents that came before him. Different from Obama, different from George W. Bush. So, what is America's relationship with China or Russia today? What do you know? And what do you think? Is it good? Is it bad? Should we do things different? Let me know in answering the question of the day. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns for me, please let me know. And other than that, have a great day. Peace.